Princess Lyra stood in the center of the Grand Council chamber, with her head held high even though her hands were bound in chains made of pure starlight that glowed against her pale skin, and the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed down on her from every direction. The chamber was carved from a single massive crystal that rose from the heart of Valeria and stretched toward the purple sky, and through its transparent walls she could see her 3 dragons circling outside with their scales flashing in the light of their twin suns as they felt her distress through the bond they shared. Ember was the largest, with scales like molten gold and fire that burned hotter than any star, and Frost was sleek and silver with breath that could freeze metal in seconds, and Shadow was midnight black, with the ability to bend light around himself and become invisible. And all 3 of them had been with Lyra since they hatched when she was just a child. The High Council sat on their elevated thrones in a semicircle around her, and their faces were cold and expressionless as they had been trained to show no emotion during judgment, and the eldest among them was Council Leader Theron, who had known Lyra since birth and had once bounced her on his knee but now looked at her as if she were a stranger. Theron spoke, and his voice echoed through the chamber like rolling thunder, and he said that Princess Lyra of House Starwind had been charged with the highest crime their people recognized, which was interfering with the natural order of other species and breaking the sacred law of non-intervention. Lyra felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to look away from Theron's gaze because she had known this moment would come from the second she made her choice 3 weeks ago, and she would not show fear or regret for what she had done. The memory was still fresh in her mind, and she had been on routine patrol along the border between Valerian space and the human territories, when her sensors picked up a distress signal coming from just inside the Forbidden Zone, where the 2 species had agreed neither would venture. She had almost ignored it because the law was clear and absolute, but then she heard the voices over the communication channel, and they were human voices filled with terror and desperation as their ship lost pressure, and their systems failed one by one. The ship was called the Explorer, and it carried a crew of 12 human scientists who had been studying asteroid composition when a debris strike had torn through their hull and knocked out their main engines and life support systems. Lyra had watched from her hidden position as the humans worked frantically to patch the holes in their ship, and she saw them running out of time as their oxygen levels dropped lower and lower, and she knew that in less than an hour, all 12 of them would be dead. The law said she should observe but never interfere, because each species must find their own path without outside influence, and it was the foundation of everything Valerian society believed, and to break it was to invite chaos and the destruction of the careful balance between worlds. But as she watched a young human woman no older than Lyra herself struggling to seal a breach with tools that were clearly inadequate, something inside the princess broke, and she could not just watch and do nothing while people died. She had reached out through her bond to Ember and Frost and Shadow, and she felt their immediate understanding and agreement, because dragons did not care about laws and politics, and they only cared about what was right and what was wrong. Together they had moved quickly, and Lyra used her ship to project a temporary force field around the damaged vessel to hold in the remaining atmosphere, while her dragons carried specialized repair materials from her cargo hold, and the humans had stared in shock as 3 massive dragons appeared out of nowhere and began welding their hull back together. Lyra herself had suited up and gone outside to help, and she worked alongside the human crew using her advanced tools to repair their engines and restore their life support, and the whole operation took less than 30 minutes, but it was 30 minutes that changed everything. The human captain, whose name was Daniel Brooks, had tried to thank her, but Lyra had simply told them to go home and never speak of what happened, because she knew even then that someone must have been watching and that she would pay the price for her choice. She had been right, and 2 days later Valerian security forces had arrived at her family estate and placed her under arrest, and her parents had begged her to deny everything, but Lyra refused to lie and admitted fully what she had done. Now she stood before the council awaiting judgment, and Theron finished reading the charges and asked if she had anything to say in her defense. Lyra took a deep breath and said that she understood the law and she knew why it existed, but she could not watch innocent people die when she had the power to save them, and if that made her a criminal, then she would accept whatever punishment they decided. The council members whispered among themselves for several long minutes, and then Theron raised his hand for silence and announced that they had reached a decision. He said that normally such a crime would result in permanent exile from Valeria and the severing of all family ties, but because Lyra was a princess and her actions could affect diplomatic relations, they had decided on a different punishment. Lyra felt ice spread through her veins as Theron explained that she would be sent to Earth as a diplomatic offering and bound in legal marriage to a human of the Earth government's choosing for a period of no less than 5 years. During this time, she would be stripped of her royal title and privileges and would live as a common citizen under human law, and she would represent Valeria as a symbol of goodwill and cooperation between their species. The worst part came next when Theron said that her dragons would remain on Valeria as insurance of her good behavior and cooperation, and they would be well cared for, but she would not see them or communicate with them until her sentence was complete. Lyra heard herself gasp and felt tears spring to her eyes because separating her from Ember and Frost and Shadow was worse than any physical torture, and it was like cutting out pieces of her own soul. She looked up through the crystal ceiling at her dragons, who were now thrashing against an invisible barrier that had been erected to contain them, and she felt their panic and rage and grief flooding through the bond like fire. Theron said the decision was final and that she would depart for Earth in 3 days, and she should use that time to say goodbye to her family and prepare herself for her new life. As the guards led her away from the chamber, Lyra cast one last look at her dragons and whispered through their bond that she would come back for them no matter how long it took, and that they should wait for her and stay strong. The 3 dragons roared in unison, and the sound shook the entire crystal structure, but there was nothing they could do as their bondmate was taken away to face a punishment that would test everything she believed about love and duty and sacrifice. The transport ship that carried Lyra to Earth was small and efficient, and nothing like the royal vessels she was accustomed to traveling in. And she sat alone in the passenger compartment with her few allowed belongings and watched through the viewport as Valeria grew smaller and smaller behind her until it was just another point of light among the stars. The 3 days between her sentencing and departure had passed in a blur of painful goodbyes, and her mother had held her and cried, while her father stood stone-faced trying to be strong, and her younger brother had promised to visit her dragons every day and tell them stories about her adventures on Earth. The hardest moment had been her final farewell to Ember and Frost, and Shadow and the council had allowed her 1 hour with them in the royal gardens under heavy guard, and she had pressed her forehead against each of their massive heads and felt their warmth and their love flowing through the bond. One last time, Ember had rumbled deep in his chest and sent her images of fire and strength and the promise that he would wait forever if necessary. And Frost had wrapped her tail around Lyra protectively and filled her mind with sensations of ice and endurance, and Shadow had simply stared at her with his ancient golden eyes and shown her visions of their eventual reunion. Now 3 weeks into the journey, Lyra could still feel them at the very edge of her consciousness, like a distant heartbeat that reminded her she was not completely alone, even though the bond grew fainter with every light year that separated them. The pilot was a professional Valerian officer who spoke only when necessary and who clearly disapproved of Lyra's actions and viewed her as a disgrace to their people, and the silence during the long journey gave Lyra too much time to think about what awaited her on Earth. She knew almost nothing about the human she was being forced to marry, and the Earth government had provided only basic information, and his name was Ryan Cooper, and he was 32 years old and worked as a veterinarian in a small town in the state of Colorado, and he had volunteered for this arrangement, though she could not imagine why any human would want an unwilling alien bride. The files said he had no criminal record and was well respected in his community, and had lost family members during the border conflicts that had been escalating between humans and Valerians over the past decade, and that last detail made Lyra's stomach twist with anxiety, because if he blamed her people for his loss, then her next 5 years would be even worse than she feared. As Earth finally came into view through the viewport, Lyra was struck by how beautiful it was, with its swirling white clouds and brilliant blue oceans and continents of green and brown, and it looked softer somehow than Valeria, with its sharp crystal mountains and purple skies. The landing procedure was smooth and efficient, and they touched down at a secure diplomatic facility outside the city of Denver, where a small group of human officials waited to receive her and process her entry into their world. Lyra stepped off the ship into Earth's gravity, which felt slightly heavier than what she was used to, and the air was thicker and smelled of unfamiliar plants and industrial processes, and the sun was a different color than the twin suns of home, and everything felt wrong and alien. The officials were polite but distant, and they guided her through various scanners and identification procedures, and had her sign documents in both Valerian and English, confirming her understanding of the terms of her sentence, and her agreement to abide by human laws during her stay. One official, whose name was Patricia Henderson, explained that she would serve as Lyra's liaison during the adjustment period, and that she could contact Patricia if she had questions about human customs or needed assistance with any problems that arose. Patricia also informed her that Ryan Cooper had been thoroughly vetted and briefed on Valerian customs and biology, and that he had agreed to provide her with her own private space and to respect her boundaries, and that the marriage would be legal. But that physical intimacy was not required unless both parties consented. Lyra felt a small measure of relief at that, because at least the humans were not expecting her to immediately play the role of a true wife to a complete stranger, though the thought of eventually having to fulfill that obligation made her feel sick with dread. After several hours of processing, Lyra was taken to a small transport vehicle that Patricia said was called a car, and they drove through the city of Denver, which was overwhelming with its tall buildings and crowds of humans and constant noise and movement. They left the city behind and headed into the mountains, and the landscape became more open and beautiful with pine forests and rocky peaks and clear streams, and Lyra found herself relaxing slightly as the crowds and chaos fell away. Patricia told her stories about Colorado and explained that Ryan had chosen to live in a small mountain town, specifically because it was quiet and peaceful and good for his work with animals, and that she thought Lyra would find it less overwhelming than city life. After 2 hours of driving, they turned onto a narrow road that wound through thick forest and finally stopped in front of a modest wooden house that sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees and wildflowers. The house was simple and rustic compared to Valerian architecture, but it had a certain charm with its covered porch and large windows that looked out over the mountains and smoke rising from a stone chimney. Patricia said this would be Lyra's home for the next 5 years, and that Ryan was inside waiting to meet her, and that she would stay for the initial introduction, but then leave them to get acquainted in private. Lyra felt her heart racing as she climbed out of the car and walked toward the house carrying her single bag of belongings. And she reminded herself that she had faced the council and survived separation from her dragons, and she could face this too. Front door opened before she reached it, and a man stepped out onto the porch, and Lyra got her first look at her assigned husband. Ryan Cooper was tall and lean, with dark hair that was slightly too long and warm brown eyes that held an expression she could not quite read, and he wore simple clothes and had his hands shoved in his pockets in a gesture that suggested he was just as nervous as she was. He did not smile or approach her, but simply said hello in a quiet voice and told her he was glad she had arrived safely and that he knew this situation was difficult for both of them. Patricia made the formal introductions and reviewed the terms of the arrangement one more time, and then she handed Lyra a communication device and told her to call if she needed anything, and drove away, leaving the two of them standing on the porch staring at each other in awkward silence. Ryan finally cleared his throat and said that he had prepared a room for her on the second floor with its own bathroom, and that she was free to decorate it however she liked, and that he would not enter without permission. He said he understood she was here against her will, and that he had no intention of forcing her into anything she was not comfortable with, and that they would take things slowly and figure out how to live together day by day. Lyra studied his face, looking for signs of cruelty or resentment, or any hint of what kind of person he really was, and all she saw was genuine kindness mixed with sadness and maybe a touch of loneliness. She told him thank you in a formal voice and asked to see her room, and Ryan nodded and led her inside the house, which smelled of wood smoke and something cooking in the kitchen, as she followed him up the stairs to her new room. Lyra wondered how she would survive 5 years in this strange place with this strange man, and whether the punishment that was meant to break her would instead somehow forge her into something stronger. The room Ryan showed Lyra was larger than she expected, with walls painted a soft cream color and a large window that looked out over the forest and mountains, and the furniture was simple but well made, with a comfortable bed and a desk and a chair, and empty shelves waiting to be filled. He pointed out the attached bathroom and showed her how to work the shower, and explained that hot water came out when she turned the handle to the left, and cold water to the right, and that human plumbing was less advanced than Valerian technology, but it worked well enough. Ryan said he would leave her to unpack and rest, and that dinner would be ready in about an hour if she was hungry, and then he left and closed the door quietly behind him, giving her the privacy he had promised. Lyra set her bag on the bed and walked to the window and pressed her palm against the cool glass and reached out through the bond to feel for her dragons across the impossible distance, and she found them there, faint, but present like whispers in the back of her mind. She sent them images of her arrival and feelings of reassurance, even though she was far from reassured herself, and she felt Ember respond with warmth, and Frost with steady calm, and Shadow with patient watchfulness, and knowing they were still connected even by the thinnest thread gave her strength. The first weeks in Ryan's house passed slowly as they learned to navigate around each other like cautious strangers, and Lyra spent most of her time in her room or in the garden that Ryan had cleared for her use behind the house. The garden became her sanctuary, and she planted seeds that Patricia had helped her obtain from a Valerian supply ship, and she worked the soil with her hands, and felt the earth beneath her fingers and tried to create a small piece of home in this alien world. Ryan left for work every morning before dawn, and returned in the early evening, and he was always careful to announce his presence and to give her space, and they ate dinner together at the kitchen table in near silence, broken only by polite questions about her day. She learned that his veterinary practice was in the nearby town, and that he treated mostly farm animals and household pets, and that he sometimes had to go out in the middle of the night for emergency calls, and he never complained about the long hours or the difficult work. Lyra also learned that Ryan lived alone and had for several years, and that his house was neat and organized in a way that suggested he had been taking care of himself for a long time, and there were no pictures of family on the walls, and no signs that anyone else had ever lived there with him. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Lyra came downstairs to find Ryan sitting on the back porch staring up at the stars, and she almost turned around to give him privacy, but something about the slump of his shoulders made her hesitate. She walked out onto the porch and sat in the chair beside him without saying anything, and they sat in silence for several minutes before Ryan finally spoke. He said he wanted to explain why he had volunteered for this arrangement, and that she deserved to know the truth, and his voice was rough, with emotion as he began to talk. Ryan told her that 5 years ago his younger sister Katie had been working as a communications officer on a civilian transport ship that was caught in the crossfire during one of the border skirmishes between human and Valerian forces. The ship had been damaged and was drifting in space, and Katie had managed to send out a distress signal before the communications system failed, and Ryan had tracked that signal and listened to the recording where his sister begged anyone who could hear to please help them. But no help had come because the incident happened in disputed space, and neither side wanted to risk escalating the conflict by sending rescue ships, and Katie and 17 other crew members had died when their life support failed and their bodies were never recovered. Ryan said the human government had contacted him 6 months ago and told him about the diplomatic arrangement with Valeria and asked if he would be willing to participate. As a gesture of goodwill between their species, they had chosen him specifically because of Katie, and they said it would be a way to honor her memory and help prevent future conflicts, and Ryan had agreed because he could not bear the thought of other families losing people the way he had lost his sister. He said he knew it was not fair to Lyra, and that she had done nothing wrong, and that forcing her into this marriage was just another example of governments using people as bargaining chips, but he had hoped that maybe something good could come from all the pain and loss. Lyra felt tears burning in her eyes as she listened, because she understood then that they were both prisoners of circumstances neither had chosen, and both mourning losses that politics and pride had caused. She told Ryan about the day she had saved the Explorer and its crew, and about how she could not just watch people die when she had the power to help them, and about her trial and sentencing, and about Ember and Frost and Shadow waiting for her on Valeria. Ryan listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said that what she had done was brave, and that she had saved 12 lives, and that no matter what her people thought, she should be proud of that choice. Something shifted between them in that moment, and the wall of awkward silence that had stood between them began to crack, and they started talking more easily about their lives and their worlds, and their hopes and fears. Lyra began, joining Ryan in the evenings when he sat on the porch and they would watch the sun set behind the mountains and talk about everything and nothing. And she found herself laughing at his stories about difficult animal patients and stubborn farmers. Ryan introduced her to his friends in town, and they welcomed her with surprising warmth and curiosity, and asked questions about Valeria and her dragons, and they seemed genuinely interested in her culture, rather than viewing her as something strange and frightening. She learned to cook human food with varying degrees of success, and Ryan gamely ate everything she made even when the results were questionable, and he taught her how to identify the local plants and animals and how to hike safely in the mountains. Ryan also surprised her one day by presenting her with several books about dragon mythology from various human cultures, and he said he thought she might find it interesting to see how humans had imagined dragons before they knew that real ones existed in the universe. Lyra spent hours reading those books, and she was amused by some of the descriptions and frustrated by others, but she appreciated that Ryan had thought about what she was missing and tried to give her some connection to the beings she loved. As autumn arrived and the leaves on the trees turned brilliant shades of red and gold and orange, Lyra discovered that Earth had its own kind of beauty that was different from Valeria, but no less magnificent. She and Ryan developed routines and small traditions like morning coffee on the porch when the weather was good, and weekly movie nights where he introduced her to human films, and she tried to explain why certain plot points made no sense to her logical Valerian mind. They also developed a comfortable silence that was no longer awkward but peaceful, and they could sit together, reading or working on separate projects without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. One cold November evening, Lyra came downstairs to find Ryan building a fire in the stone fireplace, and she sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket and watched the flames dance and felt a strange sense of contentment. Ryan sat beside her, and they watched the fire together, and he said that he knew she was still hurting and missing her dragons and that he could not fix that, but he wanted her to know that she was not alone. Lyra looked at this human man who had been forced into her life just as she had been forced into his, and who had shown her nothing but kindness and patience and respect, and she realized that somewhere along the way, her punishment had begun to feel less like suffering and more like possibility. She reached over and took his hand and squeezed it gently and said thank you, and Ryan squeezed back, and they sat together in the firelight while the first snow of winter began to fall outside the windows. Winter settled over the Colorado mountains like a heavy blanket, and the world outside transformed into something magical, with deep snow covering everything, and icicles hanging from the porch roof like crystal daggers, and the forest silent except for the occasional call of winter birds. Lyra had never experienced cold quite like this, because Valeria's climate was carefully controlled, and even in the coldest regions, the temperature never dropped to levels that required heavy clothing or made water turn solid. Ryan taught her how to dress in layers and gave her thick boots and warm coats and gloves, and he showed her how to walk carefully on ice so she would not slip and fall, and he laughed gently when she tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue like a child. They spent the long winter evenings inside, and Ryan introduced her to hot chocolate and comfort food and board games, and they would sit by the fire and play cards or chess, and Lyra discovered she was quite good at strategy games because they reminded her of the tactical training she had received as part of her royal education. Ryan also began teaching her about his work, and he explained animal anatomy and common illnesses and treatment methods, and Lyra found herself fascinated by the similarities and differences between Earth animals and the creatures of Valeria. One snowy afternoon, Ryan invited her to come with him on a house call to a farm about 20 miles away, where a horse was having complications during birth, and Lyra agreed because she was curious and because she trusted Ryan enough now to venture out with him. The farm belonged to an elderly couple named Mr. and Mrs. Chen, and they welcomed Lyra warmly despite her obvious alien features and led them to the barn where the pregnant mare was clearly in distress. Ryan worked calmly and efficiently, and he spoke in a soothing voice to the frightened animal while his hands moved with practiced skill, and he asked Lyra to help by holding equipment and handing him tools when he needed them. She watched in amazement as he guided the foal into the world and cleared its airways and made sure both mother and baby were healthy and stable, and there was something beautiful about the way he cared for these creatures with such dedication and tenderness. On the drive home, Lyra told Ryan that she had never seen anything quite like that before, and that on Valeria, most medical procedures were done by machines, and that there was something special about the personal touch and connection he brought to his work. Ryan smiled and said that was why he became a veterinarian, instead of pursuing other careers, and that animals gave back so much more than people realized, and that helping them felt like the most worthwhile thing he could do with his life. Lyra realized in that moment that she respected Ryan deeply, and that what had started as forced cohabitation had grown into genuine friendship, and maybe even something more, though she was afraid to examine that feeling too closely. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Lyra found herself thinking less about her sentence and more about the life she was building here. And she wrote letters to her family that Patricia helped her send, and she tried to describe how different everything was, but also how she was finding her place. Her brother sent back messages about Ember and Frost and Shadow, and he said they were healthy but restless, and that they spent hours every day at the barrier looking toward the sky as if they could see her across the stars. Reading those messages always made Lyra cry, but Ryan would sit with her and let her grieve, and he never tried to tell her it would be okay, or that she should stop being sad, and his quiet presence was more comforting than any words could have been. One evening in early spring, when the snow was melting, and the first flowers were pushing through the soil, Lyra was working in her garden when Ryan came home early from work. With an unusual expression on his face, he told her that he had been thinking about something for a while, and that he wanted to ask her opinion, and his nervousness made her curious and slightly worried. Ryan explained that there was a program through the Diplomatic Council that allowed human Valerian couples to petition for short-term visitation rights with family members if they could demonstrate that their relationship was stable and genuine. He said it would require them to go through interviews and prove that they were truly trying to make the marriage work and that there were no guarantees. But if they were approved, Lyra could potentially visit her dragons for a few days. Lyra felt her heart stop and restart, and she stared at Ryan in disbelief because she had resigned herself to 5 years without seeing Ember and Frost and Shadow, and the possibility of reunion, even briefly, seemed too good to be true. She asked why he would do this, and why he would help her, when it would require so much paperwork and scrutiny. And Ryan looked at her with those warm brown eyes and said simply that he cared about her, and that he knew how much she was suffering without her dragons. Tears streamed down Lyra's face, and before she could think about what she was doing, she had thrown her arms around Ryan and hugged him tightly and whispered, "Thank you," over and over. Ryan held her carefully as if she was something precious, and she felt his heartbeat against her cheek, and something warm bloomed in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with feelings she had been trying to ignore. They applied for the visitation program the next day and spent weeks preparing for the interviews and gathering documentation that proved their relationship was real and not just a political arrangement. The process was invasive and uncomfortable, and they had to answer detailed questions about their daily lives and their feelings for each other, and provide testimony from friends and neighbors about their interactions. Lyra found herself having to articulate emotions she had not fully acknowledged even to herself. And when the interviewer asked if she had developed genuine affection for Ryan, she answered honestly that yes, she had, and that he had become one of the most important people in her life. Ryan's answers were equally honest, and he said that what had started as an obligation had become something he was grateful for, and that Lyra had changed his life in ways he never expected, and that he could not imagine his days without her presence. 3 months after they submitted their application, they received word that they had been approved for a 3-day visit to Valeria, and Lyra sobbed with joy and relief, and Ryan held her and smiled and said he was happy for her. The journey to Valeria took 2 weeks, and Ryan came with her as required by the visitation protocols, and Lyra tried to prepare him for her world, and warned him that the gravity would feel lighter and the air would taste different, and that her people might not all be welcoming. When they finally arrived and the ship descended through Valeria's atmosphere, Ryan stared out the viewport in wonder at the crystal cities and purple skies and twin suns, and he said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. But Lyra was not looking at the landscape because she could feel Ember and Frost and Shadow through the bond growing stronger with every second, and her whole being ached with the need to see them and touch them and be reunited with the parts of her soul that had been missing. They landed at the royal estate where Lyra's family waited, and her parents embraced her, and her brother hugged her tightly, and they welcomed Ryan with courtesy, though she could see the curiosity and assessment in their eyes. But Lyra could barely focus on her family because she could feel her dragons approaching, and she ran toward the gardens where they were being kept. And Ryan followed close behind. When she burst through the garden gates, Ember and Frost and Shadow were waiting, and they roared with joy and surrounded her, and their minds flooded into hers with love and relief and desperate happiness. Lyra pressed her face against Ember's warm scales and wrapped her arms around Frost's neck and felt Shadow's tail curl protectively around her. And she wept and laughed and sent them wave after wave of love and reassurance. Ryan stood back and watched with wonder and a little fear as the three massive dragons greeted their bondmate. And then Ember turned his great golden head toward the human and studied him with ancient, intelligent eyes. Lyra felt Ember's curiosity through the bond, and she sent him feelings and images of everything Ryan had done for her and how he had helped her and cared for her and treated her with kindness. Ember rumbled low in his chest and slowly extended his head toward Ryan, and Lyra held her breath. As the dragon allowed the human to touch his scales, Ryan reached out with a steady hand and placed his palm on Ember's head and smiled with delight, and the other two dragons approached and permitted him to greet them as well. Through the bond, Lyra felt her dragon's acceptance of Ryan and their understanding that this human had protected their bondmate when they could not, and she realized that her two worlds were no longer separate, but beginning to blend together in unexpected ways. The 3 days Lyra spent on Valeria passed far too quickly, and she tried to absorb every moment with her dragons, while also introducing Ryan to her world and her family, and showing him the crystal cities and floating gardens and bioluminescent forests that made her homeworld unique. Ryan was fascinated by everything he saw, and he asked thoughtful questions about Valerian culture and technology, and he charmed her mother with his genuine interest in their history, and made her father laugh with stories about his veterinary misadventures on Earth. Her brother pulled Lyra aside on the second day and told her that he could see how much she had changed and that there was a lightness in her that had not been there before the trial, and he asked if she was truly happy with her human husband. Lyra found herself answering that yes, she was happy in ways she never expected to be, and that Ryan had given her something precious, which was the freedom to be herself without the weight of royal expectations or political calculations. On their last night before returning to Earth, Lyra spent hours with her dragons, and she flew on Ember's back with Ryan riding behind her, holding tight to her waist, and they soared over the purple mountains, and Ryan shouted with joy and exhilaration as they climbed higher and higher. When they finally landed, Ryan was breathless and grinning like a child, and he said that was the most incredible experience of his life. And Lyra felt her heart swell with affection for this human who embraced everything her world offered with such open enthusiasm. The goodbye was just as painful as the first separation had been. But this time, Lyra had hope, because she knew they could visit again, and because she was returning to Earth with Ryan rather than being sent there alone as punishment. During the long journey back, Ryan asked her what she wanted to do when her 5-year sentence was complete, and whether she planned to return to Valeria permanently or stay on Earth, and Lyra realized she had been avoiding thinking about that question because the answer was complicated. She told him honestly that she did not know, and that part of her longed to return home and reclaim her place and her dragons. But another part of her had grown attached to Earth and to the life she had built there. And to him, Ryan was quiet for a long time. And then he said that whatever she decided, he would support her, and that if she wanted to return to Valeria, he would understand, and that the time they had together had been a gift regardless of how it ended. His words made Lyra's chest ache because she realized that she did not want their time together to end, and that somewhere between the forced marriage and the present moment she had fallen in love with Ryan Cooper back on Earth. Spring turned to summer, and then autumn came again, and Lyra and Ryan settled back into their routines. But something had shifted between them, and the air felt charged with unspoken feelings and careful glances. One evening in late October, Ryan built a fire in the fireplace, and they sat together on the couch, as they had done many times before. But this time, when Lyra shivered against the cold, Ryan put his arm around her and pulled her close. Lyra leaned into his warmth and felt his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek, and she knew that she could not keep pretending that her feelings were just friendship or gratitude. She lifted her head and looked at Ryan and found him already watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, and before she could lose her courage, she leaned in and kissed him. Ryan made a soft sound of surprise, but then he was kissing her back with a tenderness that made her feel cherished and safe, and when they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered her name like a prayer. They talked long into the night about their feelings and their fears and what it meant to choose love when it had not been part of the original arrangement, and Ryan admitted that he had been falling for her almost from the beginning, but had not wanted to pressure her or make her feel trapped. Lyra told him that he had never made her feel trapped, and that he had shown her what it meant to be seen and valued for who she was, rather than what title she carried or what political advantage she represented. Their relationship changed after that night, and they moved through the house not as reluctant roommates, but as partners who had chosen each other, and Lyra moved her things into Ryan's room, and they built a life together that felt real and true. 2 years into her sentence, the Valerian High Council contacted her and informed her that they were reviewing her case and considering early release due to the successful diplomatic relations that had developed. Partly because of her presence on Earth, Lyra stood in Ryan's kitchen holding the communication device and feeling torn between two worlds because she had been waiting for this possibility, but now that it was here, she felt panic rather than relief. Ryan found her there, and when she explained, he smiled sadly and told her she should take the opportunity if it was offered, because he would never ask her to choose between him and the beings who were part of her soul. But Lyra had learned something important during her time on Earth, which was that love was not about possession or obligation, but about choice and growth, and she realized that her punishment had become the greatest gift of her life. She contacted Council Leader Theron directly and proposed a different arrangement, and after much debate and negotiation, the Council agreed to recognize her marriage to Ryan as legitimate and to allow her to serve as an official ambassador between their worlds, rather than a prisoner serving a sentence. Most importantly, they agreed to let Ember and Frost and Shadow come to Earth, where they could be reunited permanently with their bondmate and continue their role as guardians and companions. The day her dragons arrived on Earth was one of the happiest of Lyra's life, and they landed in the mountain meadow behind the house and roared their joy and filled the forest with fire and ice, and Shadow Ryan stood beside Lyra without fear and reached out to touch each dragon in greeting, and through the bond, Lyra felt their complete acceptance of him as part of their family. The neighbors were startled at first to see 3 massive dragons living in the mountains, but they grew accustomed to the sight of Ember flying overhead during his morning patrols, or Frost creating ice sculptures in the meadow for the local children, or Shadow playing hide-and-seek with Ryan during their evening walks. Lyra and Ryan built additions to the house and expanded the property, and created spaces where her dragons could rest comfortably while still having access to the wilderness they needed. She began working officially as an ambassador and helped facilitate trade agreements and cultural exchanges between Earth and Valeria, and used her unique position to prevent the kind of misunderstandings and conflicts that had cost both sides so many lives. Ryan continued his veterinary practice, and Lyra sometimes joined him on calls, and she used her knowledge of Valerian biology to help him develop new treatments for Earth animals, and they became a team in work as well as in life. 5 years after her arrival on Earth, Lyra stood in the same meadow where her dragons had landed and looked at the house she shared with Ryan and the life they had built together. And she thought about how strange it was that punishment could become blessing. Ryan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder and asked what she was thinking about. Lyra leaned back against him and watched Ember and Frost and Shadow playing in the distance, and said she was thinking about how grateful she was for the day she chose to save those human lives, even though it had cost her everything she knew. She said that being sent to Earth had seemed like the worst thing that could happen to her, but it had led her to Ryan, and to a love she never imagined possible, and to a life that felt more authentic and fulfilling than anything she had known in her old world. Ryan kissed her temple and said that he was grateful too, and that Katie would have liked her and would have approved of the way something good had finally come from all the pain and loss. Lyra turned in his arms and kissed him properly, and then took his hand and led him back toward the house where dinner was waiting. and where their dragons would join them later for evening meditation in the garden. She had learned that home was not a place but the people you loved and who loved you back, and that sometimes the paths we resist most strongly are the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be. The council had meant to punish her by taking away her title and her world and forcing her into marriage with a stranger, but they had accidentally given her freedom and purpose, and a love that transcended species and politics. And as the sun set behind the Colorado mountains painting the sky, in shades of gold and purple, Lyra realized that she would not change a single moment of her journey, because every hardship and every tear had been worth it to arrive at this perfect moment of peace and belonging.